Welcome in. I'm Colette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. Steve, as you know, is a world-renowned author and all-around late-talking expert. Today, we want to help answer some common questions that we get here. And we're going to start with the biggest question. Why is my child a late talker?
So the short answer is we don't know. We don't have necessarily a scientific cause at this point. It's an ongoing topic of discovery. And in fact, I'm working with a colleague to do neuroimaging, brain scans of late talking children to try to understand better about maybe some differences in their neural architecture. Those of you that have read my book know that I talked about some differences in our testing to show that, for example, there's an advantage in analytical and visual spatial and in some cases musical types of things. And so we hypothesize that has differences in the brain architecture, but now we're finally at a point where we can do some studies to see if that, is really the way we think it is or hypothesize it is. So
that was one of my questions later on.
Let
me
sorry.
make sure. No,
well, now
that we're on the topic,
okay.
So there's studies being done, right?
Yeah,
so,
at Vanderbilt. I'm part of the group.
Okay, how long will it take for us?
Well, it's a 5-year study because we're seeing the children when they're preschoolers, and then we're going to follow them for 5 years, and do scanning over that time to see how the brain develops as they're developing their language skills, and that's what we really have needed for a long time. So I'm very excited that we finally were able to get the resources to do that. Yeah,
and I love this, like breaking news right now.
Yeah, well, I guess it is. Yeah, and I'm partnering with just a tremendously talented colleague. His name's James Booth at Vanderbilt, who's the alchemist. He's not an alchemist. He's a neuroscientist doing the neural scanning. So it'll be great. And then I'm doing the speech and language and social communication testing that we have to do we call it phenotyping or characterization. So I'm doing that side, and he's doing the neuroimaging side.
Well, now that we're on this, so are these children who are late talkers going through a stage, or that have a symptom?
That will be determined. So we're going to do a comprehensive assessment, and clearly I always hypothesize a priori, and I have a pretty good hit rate as to whether it's a symptom or a stage. But we won't necessarily know that on the front end. Now, we're excluding autism, we're excluding intellectual disability, so they're late talkers, but it could be a symptom or a stage. So it's non-autistic, non-intellectually disabled late talkers, but they could have expressive language disorder. They could have expressive receptive language disorder, or it could be a stage rather than a symptom. Speech disorder, we'll know that pretty early on. That's really a separate study. So some children talk late because they can't pronounce the words very well. And I can usually tell that, but not always. So that one we'll have to see. But anyway, so we're going to be having late talkers who have language disorder and late talkers who it's a stage, and we're going to follow them up and do systematic neuroimaging. So 5 years from now, we do the podcast.
We'll be right back here.
We'll be right here to update you with it. Actually, we'll get preliminary data before then. It's not a clinical trial, so we'll know what it is. We'll have some ideas in the next couple of years, actually.
Because late talking, it sounds so complicated. I know it's simple in terms of they're late talking, but the reasons are complex a lot of times. So, with other things, you can say, oh, this is a genetic disorder, right? Is there any chance that there's some sort of gene?
Again, we don't have the genes, but it's almost certainly genetic. We look at pedigrees, families, and, late talkers run in families, and at a much higher rate.
Identify which little piece.
Well, that's complicated because it's not just going to be one gene that's responsible. Now, you could have a genetically linked condition like Rett syndrome, where that's going to affect a lot of different developmental areas, but particularly speech development. And so, sometimes there's a single gene or two gene marker, but it's going to be more than one gene. It's going to be a set of genes most likely. And there actually are some smoking gun genes that we have that people, not me, but other people have identified that are related to it. And there's studies to look at that. And we've done some preliminary studies using public health records. My colleague Raina Gordon is leading that. She's quite skilled. But anyway, there's things on the horizon, I think, that are going to give us a lot more predictive validity as to what's causing the late talking. So right now we kind of have a family of what we'll call behavioral phenotypes or symptoms or patterns that we have, and we know those, but we don't necessarily know the causes underlying those. But they're pointing us in the direction of understanding causality down the line, and I think we'll have a lot more answers as we go forward. I'm sure we will actually.
So that's the long answer as to why
Yeah,
your child
yeah. Well,
doesn't talk, but
the
the
problem
shorter
is
answer is we don't know.
Yeah, you've asked me, so of course I love this, and it's been part of my work over the last really it's going on 4 decades.
Well,
So,
I'm excited to hear this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know that you spend a lot of time doing this. Is there a large interest around the world for this to finally happen? A study like this?
There is, and actually the one of the institutes I work with at the National Institute of Health, it's called the National Institute of Deficit Communication Disorders, has just issued a bunch of new initiatives to try and have better understanding for this. It's actually called the Talk Project, and it was really cool. It was a bipartisan legislation, so there is a national push here in the U.S. and there's certainly longitudinal studies out of Australia, out of England, and so on, where we have what we call natural histories. That's a lot of what we know about symptom or stage development. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff on the horizon. There is a renewed interest, and certainly, with the rise in autism, and there probably is a legitimate rise in autism, in addition to just kind of maybe taking kids who have some other form of late talking and having them be on the spectrum and expanding the spectrum. There probably is a increase in the core incidence. So we really need to understand that, and so that's part of the push too.
Yeah, okay. Once you get the results, like how will that benefit other families down the road?
Well, so let's say, for example, that we get probabilistic genetic markers. Let's say we get probabilistic neurosignatures. Then that's going to help, help us down the line to say, well, your child, has these genes which suggest that the late talking is more likely to be a stage than a symptom, or your child has these genes, so those are associated with autism. So we want to be, thinking about that and doing the best prevention we can do and support we can do for autism, and so on. So having more information is always good.
Yeah.
Like when we do an assessment, I'm assessing these different domains of speech, language, and social development, and those factors then allow me to make a pretty good differential diagnosis, relatively accurate diagnosis. And if you give me more information, I'm going to be even better at that. And then these biological markers are going to be really helpful.
When you take all that information, will it help you better determine if a child is likely to catch up with their peers, or kind of a time frame for that?
Sure, yeah, because then we'll know. Let's say that one of the things I think that we're going to verify, we know this behaviorally or developmentally. So what happens with late talkers a lot of times is that their visual spatial skills are being developed ahead of their talking ability. And so it could be that there's a trade-off in development. And so you could have a neural marker that says, oh, this visual spatial region of the brain is being developed while the language area is still a little bit undeveloped. And we have some markers for how that works, or I shouldn't say we, the neuroscientists have that. And so you could look for that signature, and that would help you to say, oh, this child's actually spending their brain power development right now on puzzles and three-dimensional visualization and analytical abilities, being escape artists, which late talkers are notorious escape artists.
We had a family member once say you either have a walker or a talker.
Well, right. Yeah, there is that kind of thing. Right. Exactly. Yeah. We call the escape artists elopers, which I think is a good name for it.
I like that.
Yeah.
So all of that information will help you kind of give parents a direction. Will it benefit parents?
It'll give parents and it'll give clinicians better. So, if you think about, for example, type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes, at least early on, the people make insulin. Unlike me, I don't make insulin. I'm a type 1 diabetic. And so there were a lot of genetic studies, like these are classic genetic studies, where they actually identified several genes that predicted type 2 diabetes. And so now when someone's a teenager or, in their early 20s, because type 2 diabetes usually develops later than type 1, you can actually, get in and do some prevention because that person's likely to develop type 2 diabetes. Now, before that, they'd get the diabetic symptoms and they go along. And then initially it was discovered because it's like, well, we're giving them insulin and it's not helping. They're actually called insulin resistant for that reason. And so anyway, long story short, when you have more markers, and that gives you more information on how to better manage, how to better support the family and the child.
Yeah. What would you say are the most common reasons a child would be considered a late talker?
So basically, there's these temperament things that I'm talking about. So obviously the first thing is they're not using words, and tend to be strong-willed. I think you could have Mary comment on whether I'm strong-willed or not. But late talkers do tend to have a strong-willed deterministic streak. Like one of the things that we've seen over the years is that when a late talker is engaged in an activity like a puzzle or they're building something, they want to do that to completion. They don't want to move away from it until they've mastered it. And it's also true for like a topic. In fact, yesterday it was really cool. I saw a young man he's going into college. It's funny, I saw him and I had this vision of him when he was 3 when I first met him. So time moves on. But anyway, he got interested in math, and he would just do math to not the exclusion of other things, but he was very captured by that. And if he had a math concept he was interested in, he would just stick with that until he mastered it. And I would say that's a beneficial thing. But if you're in a classroom where you're going to do math for an hour or for half an hour, and then you're supposed to switch to social studies, then that can be something that people don't necessarily like about a late talker, but they tend to have that kind of temperament. So there's the late talker temperament that goes along with it. Traits,
they're
traits.
That word before,
and the same thing's true for early talkers, right? So kids who talk early tend to be very social. They tend to be very interested in literature, stories. They're very imaginative. They're very verbal. Oh, is that you?
I was an early talker.
Okay.
He's our late talker.
I wasn't aware she was an early talker, but obviously she's quite skilled at what she does.
Haven't stopped talking since.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's true of me too. So once I started talking, I've been spending the rest of the time making up for lost ground.
Is it always the case that a child's late talking is a sign of developmental delays?
So if you use the word developmental delay actually has a lot of different meanings. So if you use the word, developmental delay to refer to the fact that they're late in talking, sure, they're behind in talking, and they're going to be behind in the things that are related to that. Okay. But in terms of eligibility, some states use the term developmental delay actually as a designation for when the late talking is a symptom of having educational needs, and it'll make them eligible for speech language and preschool services. Normally it's used in preschoolers. So, and in a way I kind of like it because I like that eligibility, because when a child gets identified as developmental delayed, they're kind of working with the child and seeing how they pattern their learning before making a longer term determination if they have autism or speech and language delay or some other symptom, some other eligibility category. So developmental delay can be a generic category for eligibility. That's why I was saying it depends on, how you're using that term. So they're late talking, there's a delay in their development, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're eligible for developmental delay services, which is going to require, a more extensive delays than when the late talking is just a stage.
And, there's some late talkers that pronounce their words perfectly. They just talk late. And then there's other children who have a harder time with that. How do you categorize them, or is there a need to categorize them?
There is, yeah. So we have a category called speech disorder. It'll also be called articulation disorder. It can also be called phonological disorder. So these people, we always make so many words. I like speech disorder because I separate things into speech and language. Speech is the pronunciation part of it. Language is the vocabulary, the word endings, the sentence structures. And then we have the social use of language, or pragmatics. And so those are kind of the bins that I like to use. anyway, yeah, there are children that have trouble pronouncing words. Again, working with Down syndrome, most children with Down syndrome, when they talk, you might notice that someone with Down syndrome, they're absolutely beautiful and some of the most wonderful people on the planet. Their faces look a little different. And part of that is that the muscles and the structures in their mouth make it harder for them to say certain sounds. And so many children with Down syndrome that I work with, I have to help them, with speech pronunciation. Now, the reason that's important is that can actually, if it's severe enough, that can actually have the child be a late talker where they're not talking. And some late talkers are perfectionists, so they won't actually say a word until they can say it well. And I will just say that I have had, it's unfortunate, but I have had cases where a child has a speech disorder. It's really a straight speech disorder, but they have been kind of put into the autism bin. I had a case just this past year where the little guy was put into an autism intervention program with what I talked about, where they have him sit down at a table and they have him name words. And his speech was so disordered he couldn't do that. And so he really got very frustrated and very upset. So his parents took him out of that program. And then 2 years later, I didn't see him then. They brought him to me 2 years later. And, I worked with him and he was talking enough now. It was clearly a severe speech disorder. And the reason it's an important story is that, the dad is this big guy. He was a football player in college, a lineman in college. He's a big man. And he just started crying because he had been so worried about his son. And I have to be careful. I don't know what he was like when he was 2, but I know that at age 4, 4.5, straight speech disorder. And so if you think about it, let's say that I'm trying to teach you German and you can't pronounce German words. And I'm saying, say this, say this, say this, and you can't do it. It's going to be pretty hard. And you think about like a little 2-year-old, maybe not a good way to try to teach them. Sure. So we want to make sure we have a good diagnosis. One of my mentors at Purdue, who recently retired, just a brilliant scientist, he did a study where he looked at children's words, and it turns out that all children, they'll tend to say words where they can say the sounds. So the example I like to use is, let's say I'm in a bilingual situation and I have a choice between dog and perro. I'm going to say dog because it's easier to say. And so children are very sensitive to how well they're saying sounds, and they will actually avoid saying words some will, but they can't say very well. So it's just important to think about that aspect.
It made me think that maybe there's a child who has a speech disorder, but then gets diagnosed with some sort of behavior disorder if they react a certain way, not being able to say that. Is that pretty common then?
Thankfully, it's not common, but it's certainly not rare.
Okay.
So it happens.
It happens.
Yeah. I want to be careful here. We talk a lot about, like the case I just talked about, where things don't go as good as you can hope. There's many, many cases where everything happens well. And I don't want people to get overly paranoid. There's wonderfully dedicated clinicians who are skilled, who know what they're doing. So many times I'll walk into a school where I'm supporting it or work with some clinicians and everything is going well, and it just makes me so happy. And that absolutely can happen. So I don't want people listening to this. We
don't want to just talk about worst case scenario.
No, but I mean, they're the ones that are salient, right?
Sure.
So, there's so many times when, someone has late talking that's a symptom and they get it right and they give the right supports, and that happens a lot, and it's really good. So I don't want people to think these are, what always happens.
Yeah. A lot of questions from parents. They want to know, how can they best support their child? So in your experience, when a family comes to see you, what do you send them home with?
Yeah. So I love that question. So I'm gathering my words here because I want to say this as clearly as I can. What I really, really want families to do is to try to step back and be able to just see their child as they are now. And the reason I'm saying that is that it's so understandable that you're thinking about, gosh, they're behind. Our society is so complicated. Schools are so competitive. My child's behind, they're talking, and you just kind of get ahead of yourself. And I think, one of the poignant stories I have is there's a mom I worked with many years ago. Her son's now in his 20s and doing amazingly. His late talking was a stage, but she was so worried about him when he was a toddler that she spent a lot of time and nights on the internet, and whenever she'd see him, it would kind of cause her to be teary-eyed. And I think all those things kind of, I feel like these wonderful childhood years, like you can tell just when I talk about my grandson Ellis, who's visiting us this week. He's almost 11 months old, and it's just, the moments are so magical. It's just, they're just the most special moments you can imagine. And I just worry that these wonderful, special moments, that they either get missed altogether or they get diminished because we're so worried. So you might say, oh, I'm going to say, hey, you should do this, that, or the other. You should talk to them in this way, or, read books to them, do all that kind of stuff. But the most important thing is to step back and try to disconnect from societal pressure. And there's shaming too that happens, and it's really hard. But if someone can just look at their child and have that attunement and that joy happen, that's the most important thing. And it's not easy to do, but it's the most important thing and the best thing that I can help parents do.
Enjoy each and every moment.
Absolutely. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I will tell you, I'm sorry, I may have said this on another podcast, and I'm sorry, Mary, I'll apologize ahead of time. When Vincent was a little toddler, and this helped me to have insights into moms, I was helping him learn vocabulary, and it took him a long time. He was a really slow vocabulary learner. I had to present vocabulary to him hundreds of times before he'd get into this long-term memory. And Mary would always be asking me, do you think he's going to be okay in school? Do you think he's, going to grow up and get married? I mean, these were all really important questions. And her anxiety was, I'm happy to say he got married to a wonderful woman, and he now has 4 children. And so, life has gone along really well. And, it's turned out well.
In the moment, it's hard.
It's really hard
to see past what you're in.
No,
right
but
now.
I realized that because and I don't mean this in a comparative way. I'm a late talker too. And Vincent was Vincent. He was who he was. And those things weren't really in my mind. I just figured they would unfold the way it was. And by the way, I also want to say that even when the late talking is a symptom, and let's say a child has Down syndrome or intellectual disability or autism, I don't want you to think that's a bad outcome. It's that person. And we want to have joy, and we want to, I'm sure those of you listening to this podcast know how much I just think children with Down syndrome are wonderful. They're just the most special people on the planet. And they're learning differently in a different way, but they're also very special and valuable. So I don't want you to hear, Vincent got married and had 4 kids, so therefore, that's a great outcome, which it is, but there's other great outcomes too. Anyway, long story short, it's normal to look into the future, but to the extent you can look into the moment, that's what you want to do.
Yeah, we're all on a different path.
Yeah.
So enjoy
absolutely.
the path you're on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But certainly with your child, every moment that you have with them is very special and very precious. Yeah. And don't let worry steal that from you. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We know that we were able to answer some questions, but as always, if you have more questions, please send them our way. Mary and Steve are so happy to answer them.
Always.
You can put those in the questions you have in the comment section below. Be sure to click subscribe so we can keep getting this information to you. Hit the bell. And of course, you can always check out the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And remember, the best thing for your child is you.